scientists, including evolutionists, are not yet able to rationally explain the origin of life. It's not to say that it is impossible or that it will never be explained in scientific terms, but only to point out the fiction behind our current scientific discourse. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So chapter 2, section 4, we're going through the examples of the natural argument. So the last example I want to go through is the photosynthesis at the origin of life. Why? Because as a spectroscopist, I did my PhD on photosynthesis. That's what I studied in my PhD. I spent about 7 years looking at how plants convert sunlight to chemical energy. And it's quite fascinating. So after touching on the exceptionality of life and the earth as a cradle for life, I now want to talk about a subject that is probably less known to the non-scientific community, but which is certainly as exceptional: photosynthesis. So again, photosynthesis is how plants convert sunlight into chemical energy. So indeed, one does not have to look to the horizon of our universe to find marvels of organizations and fine-tuned processes. Similar marvels are found in the weeds that one steps on and which are considered as nuisance. So these weeds, like any other plants, derive the energy from a process called photosynthesis, the process by which solar energy is converted into chemical energy. I studied photosynthesis in my early postgraduate years. The entire plant kingdom, as well as some bacteria, even photosynthetic bacteria, use this mechanism to live, to grow, and to multiply. So one of the consequences of photosynthesis is the production of atmospheric oxygen. The process itself involves a series of small molecules, colorful molecules, the chlorophylls that makes the plant look green, which are organized in such a way that they absorb sunlight, transmit that energy to one another until it reaches a specific part and release an electron, a high energy electron. So these electrons are then used to pump protons across the plant's membrane. Then it generates an electrochemical gradient. This cellular membrane then acts as a dam that keeps proton from flowing through and to reach equilibrium, and can thus be equated to a battery with its positive and negative side. This biological battery ultimately drives the production of a universal biological energy currency called ATP. So let me rephrase. You have like you can imagine, the cell is like a ball. It has a membrane. Within that membrane you have proteins. These specific proteins, when light hits them, they capture the light, they become excited, they pass this excitation around. It reaches a specific component called the special pair that when it is excited, it releases an electron. That electron travels from step to step, like going down a ladder, and ultimately that stepping down and that release of the electron drives proton across the membrane. So you start accumulating proton. Proton is a charge, a positive charge. You start accumulating positive charges on one side of the membrane. So one side becomes positive. It has more proton than usual. The other side gets depleted. It becomes negative. So you can imagine that now the membrane of your cell is charged. One side is positive, the other is negative. It's like a battery. It's an unstable configuration. Protons, the charged one, wants to go back across the membrane to equilibrate. They can do so, but when doing so, they'll have to go through tunnels. By going through that tunnel, it will make a rotor spin, like a physical rotor spin, the rotor of the molecule called ATP synthase. By spinning, it will take two different molecules and force them together and make them combine to form ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is like a chemical energy currency. So all these to show that once you absorb light, it triggers a cascade of reactions that produce chemical energy. That ATP, then that molecule of ATP can be transported across the plant and be used in specific part to do things, to metabolize, to grow, to repair. So that biological battery ultimately drives the production of a universal biological energy currency called ATP. So focusing now on the first few steps, the different molecules involved in the capture of solar energy as well as in the release and transport of the electron are all maintained within a protein matrix. You can imagine it's like a huge antenna system that captures the light and emits an electron. That protein matrix is called a reaction center. That's where the reaction takes place. The first chemoelectric reaction takes place. So interestingly, one finds the same core structure, the same configuration of that machinery, that reaction center, across the kingdom in all photosynthetic organisms without exceptions. So by assuming that each species has developed from a previous one, taking an evolutionary perspective, inheriting some of the characteristics of the parent species, one comes to the conclusion that that reaction center, as sophisticated as it may be, was already present in the earliest form of life, photosynthetic life. So this is because the first form of life is believed to be photosynthetic. In conclusion, this reaction center, with its complex molecular structure, must have been fully operational more than 3 billion years ago. So that's quite incredible. It's like, although from an evolutionary point of view, life evolved over billions of years, the complexity must have been at the origin already. Like the complexity of the photosynthetic pathway mechanism, all these proteins working together, must have been in the first organism already. So although this reaction center must have existed as a complete functional engine from the start, certain of its properties have evolved over time, sure. But the overall core structure and principle remain the same. To imagine that such a reaction center can appear by chance, it's like disassembling a two-stroke engine, putting all the bits, all the pieces in a bag and just shaking a bit and hoping that if you give enough time, if you shake well enough, the engine will assemble itself. And even more, I would further add that this machinery does not rely on random assembly of amino acids. The reaction center is a dimer. It's two parts. These two parts are identical. So you cannot produce random parts. You have to produce the same part again and again and again, so that two can come together and function. The reaction center doesn't work if you have only one side. It works only if you have the two sides together. So the reaction center is a dimer, meaning that it consists of a doublet of each constituent protein. The probability of finding one protein of each is already low if you assume randomness. But the probability of finding two that meet each other and assemble before one deteriorates indicates the need for mass production of such proteins. Currently, the only biological process known to accurately create multiple copies of identical proteins is the one which involves coding of genetic material through DNA and RNA. And molecular coding comes with all its associated molecular machinery that is necessary to maintain the genetic code, decoding it, and then translating it into proteins. Even more interesting, the fact that this biological engine, like the combustion engine in your car, does not work on its own. To be functional, it needs a context. It needs to be implemented in a membrane, to be surrounded by a series of other proteins that collect the electron, gives a proton, takes the proton back, pumps it across the membrane, so that it doesn't get blocked or jammed. It also requires a series of other proteins capable of using the potential gradient, like that separation of protons, to generate ATP, like the ATP synthase. So in other words, to make a photosynthetic cell needs a a context. It requires a fully functional biological system to preserve its design and to use it appropriately. In short, scientists, including evolutionists, are not yet able to rationally explain the origin of life. It's too complicated to explain. I mention this not to say that it is impossible or that it will never be explained in scientific terms, but only to point out the fiction behind our current scientific discourse. Here again, in light of the precision and the omnipresence of photosynthesis within the vegetal kingdom, my mind naturally turns toward a grand orchestrator. جزاك الله خيرا. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.